It's tough for all 32 teams in the NFL to get better over the offseason. For one team in particular, though, in the New Orleans Saints, they were tasked with an almost impossible situation with their cap space and with their roster construction. It was pretty difficult to see that the New Orleans Saints were going to have a chance at getting much better than they were in 2024. However, I think they did a pretty good job with both personnel and staff decisions to actually make a better team in 2025. Beginning with the staff decisions that New Orleans made in the offseason so far, bringing in Kellen Moore, Doug Nussmeier, and Brandon Staley to be the leaders of their respective groups. Kellen Moore is going to come in as the head coach, Nussmeier as the offensive coordinator, and Staley as the defensive coordinator. I think even though Brandon Staley is, one of the least regarded head coaches of the last 10 to 15 years, and not many people really even know the name Doug Nussmeier. I think that this was a pretty good job from New Orleans filling out their coaching staff, and it's highlighted by Kellen Moore. He's been one of the more intriguing head coaching candidates over the last half decade. And you look at his, I don't want to say production, but you look at the track record of teams and how they performed when Kellen Moore was either the offensive coordinator or quarterbacks coach with Dallas, or when he was the offensive coordinator with LA, the LA Chargers and Philadelphia. I mean, all of the time, most of the time, I guess. Dallas had a pretty good running game when Kellen Moore was there. Philadelphia had the best running game in the NFL while Kellen Moore was there. And obviously, Philadelphia won a Super Bowl while Kellen Moore was the offensive coordinator. Now, obviously, the New Orleans Saints aren't going to have a top 5, even top 10 running game in the NFL in 2025. I think, it's just tasked with hopefully making a better unit. He comes to the table with a pretty good offensive line, highlighted by guys like Cesar Ruiz, Eric McCoy, Talise Fuaga. You have a pretty young offensive line. He can hopefully help mold those guys into a cohesive unit. And then you hope that Alvin Kamara still has some good juice left. You have that maybe you can actually get something out of Kendre Miller this year after 2 straight years of pretty mediocre performances. And as far as the defense goes, they weren't great last year. There were worse units, though, on the defensive side of the ball in the NFL. And I think a lot of what went wrong for the defense was, it definitely didn't help that Derek Carr got injured. There was 2 different head coaches. There was just a revolving door. At pretty much any position you can think of, the offensive line was decimated. The defense had injuries. The quarterback position was never consistent. And so it's going to be hard as a defense to really play great ball when you have all of those things going on. So let's look at the additions that New Orleans made in the offseason so far through free agency. You have a pretty mild group of players here. I wouldn't say that you have anyone that really sticks off the page other than Justin Reed, who is a very good signing at the safety position. But, it's the guys around the edges. You get somebody like a Brandon Cooks to come back. You get Will Clapp to possibly be, a swing guard or center for your team. You get, some options in terms of depth for your team. And then you obviously re-sign guys like Chase Young, Jawan Johnson to those big deals that they gave them. I don't necessarily love the money that they gave out to Young and Johnson, especially when you think about the fact that they lost Paulson Adebo to the New York Giants in a contract that I think New Orleans probably could have matched. And maybe Paulson Adebo just didn't want to come back to New Orleans. He probably was one of the more sought-after cornerbacks in the NFL in free agency this year. And we saw a lot of really good players go to New York that are secondary players. So I guess, maybe there's a plan New York has for that secondary group. But as far as New Orleans is concerned, I don't know after Paulson Adebo what they lost that's really going to make a huge impact. Lucas Patrick, you say maybe is one of those depth pieces on the offensive line you don't really want to use. And it does seem like Willie Gay was a really good player when he came to New Orleans and left as someone that was kind of an afterthought. But like I said, I mean, there's not a lot defensively or offensively that you lost that you can really point at and say is a major loss other than Paulson Adebo. And now moving to what this leads them to be able to do in the draft. I mean, they have 6 selections in the top 131 overall picks of this year's draft. So there's a very good opportunity in front of New Orleans to add young, cheap talent to this team. And I really emphasize the cheap part because the way that New Orleans has done their contracts over the past few years, they've really put themselves in a position to, like they were this year. They had a terrible chance of making their team better. And they did a pretty good job with that being said. But they basically were coming into free agency with an arm tied behind their back with how difficult it was going to be. So now with the draft, you have a boatload of picks. You have 9 total picks in this year's draft, and you could have more if you decide to maybe trade back in the first round or whatever you decide to do. And so it's a bit of an exciting time to really look at this roster and who could be on it here in about a month when the draft happens. And you think about how much better this team can be in 2025 and beyond. I think there's a really good chance that, this team's not going to compete for a Super Bowl anytime soon. But this is a weak NFC South. And if they hit on 2 or 3 draft picks this year, maybe Derek Carr has a better year off of the injury. Like I said, maybe guys like Kendre Miller come in and have a great year 3. And these names that they added in free agency that aren't the household names like everybody knows, but they're guys that can help out and contribute. Overall, honestly, I give the New Orleans Saints just a solid B. There's not that over the top move that really sets them up for either the present or the future. But like I said, they came into this situation with not much of an ability to do anything. And they really succeeded at actually making the team better, even with a poor opportunity in front of them. So yeah, a solid B grade. I think that's pretty reasonable. I don't think there's anything that you can point at to New Orleans either losing or adding in free agency and say that it's a poor move, other than, like I said, losing Paulson Adebo. But like I said, he was one of the more sought-after players in general in free agency this year. And so I don't see, it's not a huge negative that they lost him to a team that wanted him. It's really not.